The train had been running for 4 hours before Harry Potter stopped pretending to look out the window. The Scottish hills had given way to the Midlands. The Midlands had given way to something flatter and considerably greyer, and at some point Hermione had left the compartment to help Neville find his toad, and hadn't come back. Ron sat across from Harry, working through the last of a box of cauldron cakes he'd bought from the trolley, and neither of them had said very much for a while. That was fine. Harry didn't have a great deal to say. He was going back to the Dursleys. He'd known since May. In the abstract way, you know something you're not ready to consider properly, and now it was fully July, and the abstract had arrived, and what he felt about it was nothing. Not dread, not despair, just nothing. The way you stop feeling your feet after standing on them for a very long time. The train was loud. Students in other compartments were celebrating with no particular restraint. Somewhere down the corridor, Fred and George were doing something inadvisable and laughing about it with the quality of laughter that meant someone else was shortly going to be miserable. Harry listened to the general roar of the carriages and thought about the dungeon under the school. Quirrell was dead. The stone was gone. Voldemort's wraith, what remained of it, formless and diminished, had fled when Quirrell died, had lifted from Harry's skin like smoke and dissolved into nothing. And somewhere in the world, or perhaps beyond it, that thing persisted in some way Harry couldn't picture and didn't want to. He had won something. It had just left him feeling quiet in a way that didn't particularly resemble triumph. He pressed his forehead to the cool glass and watched the fields go past. "You're doing the staring thing," Ron said. Harry looked over. Ron had chocolate on his chin and didn't know it. "I'm not doing anything. You're doing the thing where you look out the window, but you're not actually looking at anything." Ron folded the cauldron cake box with unnecessary precision. "It's a bit unsettling." Harry turned back to the window, then decided Ron was right and looked at the compartment ceiling instead. His trunk sat in the rack above him. His wand was in his pocket, holly and phoenix feather 11 inches supple, the one Ollivander had pressed into his hands with that wide, pale-eyed assessment. Hedwig dozed in her cage on the seat beside him, her head tucked under one white wing. Under his robes folded against his ribs was the invisibility cloak. He had all his things. He was going back to the Dursleys. He wasn't certain what he was apologizing for. Ron shrugged with the generosity of someone who had a place to go to. "You could write to me," he offered, "as much as you want. Mum won't mind the owls. She likes Hedwig." "I know," Harry said. He did know. He filed it away with everything else he knew about the Weasley house, from Ron's letters that it was loud, that something was always cooking, that there were too many people in it and not enough of anything else, and apparently none of this was considered a problem. He was almost certainly going to spend the summer at a place that smelled like nothing at all, except clean carpet. He was almost certainly going to be fine. King's Cross arrived with its usual industrial grey welcome, and the train slowed and stopped and released its hundreds of students onto the platform in a hissing, shouting, trunk-scraping rush. Harry stepped down onto the platform and immediately lost Ron in the crowd, found him again by his height and the red hair, and was following him through the press of people when they came through the barrier and into the Muggle station, and Harry nearly walked directly into Molly Weasley. She was standing at the edge of the arrivals space with Arthur beside her, scanning the crowd as she always seemed to scan crowds, like she was doing a mental head count. When she found Harry, her face did something that was mostly warmth, but also faintly worried, in the way it sometimes was when she looked at him specifically, as though he were a stitch that might unravel. "Harry, dear." She took his shoulder briefly, a firm squeeze, and then reached into her cardigan pocket. "This came for you from Romania. Charlie asked us to hold it for you. He didn't want it getting lost in the post pile at your aunt's." She held out an envelope. It was well-traveled, the edges soft, the address written in a hand Harry didn't recognize. He looked at it for a moment before he took it. "Romania," Ron said with the tone of someone processing new information rapidly. Charlie wrote to Harry. "Charlie never writes to anyone," Molly said mildly, and looked at Harry with that unexplained expression again, as though she were waiting to see what he did with the letter and already knew. She didn't offer to explain. She went back to collecting the others. Harry put the envelope in his pocket. He held it through the platform chaos of trunks and owls, and an argument about whose umbrella was whose, and didn't open it until he was in the Weasleys' car, with Ron asleep against the window and the city going past in a smear of yellow lights. Charlie thanked him for helping with Norbert. First, he wrote that the dragon was adjusting, that she was eating well, getting used to the Romanian longhorns in the adjacent enclosure, beginning to settle into herself. He wrote it simply, without drama. He wrote that Ron had spoken about Harry in every letter he'd sent over the year, that from what he'd read, Harry had handled himself well, and that was worth something in Charlie's estimation. Then he said, the reserve was extraordinary, and most people never got to see it. He had a spare bunk in the handler's quarters. He'd be glad of a visitor, if Harry ever wanted to come. He did not say, you deserve something better than going back to relatives who don't want you. He didn't need to. Harry read the letter twice in the dark of the moving car, with Ron breathing quietly beside him, and then he folded it carefully along its original creases and looked out the window at the lights going past, and thought about it the whole way to Little Whinging. Vernon Dursley said no. The moment he finished reading, in a voice that suggested the question itself had been an affront, Petunia said nothing. She put the letter down on the kitchen table and went to stand at the sink with her back to them, looking out at the neighbor's fence, and she did not say no. Harry noticed this. He had learned, over 11 years of living in this house, that Petunia's silences had a shape to them, and this one was different from her usual silence, which was simply the absence of acknowledgement. He couldn't have named what this one was. He filed it away. He went up to his room and sat on the edge of his bed, his small, just adequate bed, in his small, just adequate room, and looked at the letter one more time before he tucked it into the front pocket of his trunk. The owl arrived the next morning before breakfast. It was not Hedwig. It was a plump ginger bird Harry recognized as belonging to the Weasley household, and it deposited a sealed envelope on Vernon Dursley's marmalade, and sat on the kitchen windowsill with its feet clamped tight and an expression that suggested it would wait as long as it needed to. Harry was not shown the letter. He ate his toast at the table and listened to Vernon go through 3 distinct emotional registers in the next room: disbelief, argument, and then, finally, a silence that meant something had gone out of him. When Vernon came back, he was very red and very still, and he looked at Harry for a long moment, with the expression of a man who has agreed to something he found profoundly unreasonable. "Well," Vernon said, "that was all. That was enough." Harry went upstairs and packed his trunk. He put his wand in first, then his school things, then the cloak folded flat at the bottom. He put Hedwig's travel water in her cage and told her she was going somewhere. She clicked her beak and considered him with her amber eyes and seemed, as she often seemed, to find the situation entirely expected. He stood in the doorway of his room and looked at it. He had been in this house for 10 years. More than 10 years, nearly his whole life. Or the life he could remember. There was nothing on the walls. Nothing in it felt like him, just the particular quality of a space used as storage and occasionally as somewhere to sleep. He wasn't certain what he'd expected to feel about leaving it. What he felt was nothing. The same quiet nothing as on the train. He picked up his trunk. He walked down the stairs. He was walking out a door that had been left open, and this was not dramatic, and the sky outside was pale and ordinary, and Hedwig shifted in her cage with the patient dignity of an owl who had always expected more interesting transport than this. He didn't look back. The portkey was a length of old rope, knotted at one end, and it sat on the kitchen table at the burrow, looking entirely harmless, until Molly Weasley told them all to hold on, and Harry touched it. And the world came apart. It was not like flying. Flying was extension, the body becoming something larger and faster than itself. This was its opposite, the ground jerking away, the sky tilting, everything smearing into a roar of color and rushing air, and a sensation like being gripped by the ribcage and hauled sideways through a space that wasn't quite there. Harry's stomach arrived a half-second after the rest of him. His knees hit grass. Strong sunlight, the smell of smoke. He was on his hands and knees in a mountain meadow somewhere in Romania, and the sky above him was a shade of blue that did not particularly resemble the English sky. Cleaner, higher, more committed to the enterprise of being blue. The air was warm and smelled of things that were not clean carpet. Ron landed beside him. Fred and George came down in a heap several feet away, George laughing before he'd fully arrived. "Still think portkeys are rubbish," Ron said. He was sitting in the grass, looking at his hands. "They're extremely rubbish," Harry agreed. He stood up and found his glasses, which had gone slightly crooked. The meadow ran up toward a tree line of dark pines, and past the pines, visible in fragments through the trees, was a stone wall. It was very tall. Beyond it, something moved, vast and slow, a dark shape trailing smoke against the blue sky. And Harry forgot entirely what he was going to say next. Charlie was walking toward them from the direction of the wall. He was about Harry's height as a grown man, which meant not especially tall, but built in the way that suggested the height was somewhat beside the point. Red hair, cut short, and sunburn, and a collection of scars on his forearms that Harry would later learn were routine souvenirs of the work. He looked younger than Harry had expected from the accumulated weight of Ron's descriptions. Ron spoke of Charlie the way people spoke of places they'd never been, but were certain were extraordinary, with a reverence that had given Harry a vague impression of someone much older. He stopped in front of them and looked at Harry with an expression that was simply assessment, nothing performed about it. "You actually came," he said. "Yeah," Harry said. That was the whole of the first exchange. It seemed to be sufficient. Charlie clasped Ron's shoulder, ruffled something on George's head that made George protest, and led them all back toward the wall. As they got closer, the scale of the enclosures became legible in a way that made Harry's brain quietly refuse to process it. He had expected something like a very large zoo. What he found was closer to a landscape, enclosures the size of football pitches, bounded by stone walls twice the height of a house, and reinforced with something that made the air above them shimmer slightly, like heat rising off summer tarmac. The world beyond the wall smelled of smoke and something sulphurous and old, and there was a bass percussion to it, a deep occasional percussion that Harry felt in his chest before he heard it as sound. "That's the horntail," Charlie said, without looking back. "They like to announce themselves." Fred and George had stopped pretending to walk at anything close to a normal pace, and were essentially vibrating. Fred pointed at a distant shape visible above the eastern wall. Is that a ridgeback? That's a ridgeback. Norwegian ridgeback," Charlie said. "She's called Norberta. You've heard of her." He looked at Harry. "She's settling in well," Charlie said. He said it simply, as though it were merely a report. "She's young still, under a year. The Longhorns aren't sure what to make of her." He took them along the outer path, identifying the enclosures as they passed. The Romanian Longhorn, whose long golden horns were visible above the nearest wall like an impossible sunrise, the common Welsh Green, which was smaller than Harry had imagined and no less alarming for it, which announced itself again and sent a column of flame above its wall that made Fred actually stumble. The Swedish short snout was blue-grey and quick, visible only as a moving shadow. The Chinese fireball could be heard, but not seen. Harry did not speak. He was doing something that he would not have had a word for a week ago, but which Charlie had named in his letter without quite naming it. He was looking at a thing that most people never got to see, and he was trying to look at it clearly, and he was not saying anything because he did not yet have anything worth saying about it. Ron and Fred and George had 2 days. This had been established at the Burrow with the particular clarity of something Molly had decided, and therefore was not a negotiation. On the morning of the 3rd day, they assembled at the Boundary Meadow with their things, and Ron stood with Harry while Fred and George said something to Charlie about the horntail that made Charlie snort right, Ron said. It was not quite a question. Every week, Harry said. Ron gripped his shoulder once. There was something else in it, something Harry recognized as a feeling Ron was 12 years old and therefore had no particular vocabulary for. He wasn't certain what he felt about Harry staying, and he wasn't certain it was only glad. His joy at 2 days of dragons and his mild, unexplained resentment at Harry's arrangement ran alongside each other without resolving, and it would be some time before either of them understood it well enough to talk about. Fred found Harry's eye. "Don't get eaten," he said. George considered this. "No, do get eaten a little. Just enough for a story. Nothing that needs a major healer." Then the knotted rope glowed, and they grabbed it, and they were gone. The meadow was quiet. Charlie stood beside Harry for a moment, looking at the space where 4 people had been, and then he turned and headed back through the gate without comment, and Harry followed him. The handlers' quarters were a long, low building on the inside of the perimeter wall, made of the same dark stone as everything else, and furnished in the way of places where practical people sleep without much ceremony. Charlie showed Harry a bunk at the end of the row. It was narrow. There was a window above it that faced the mountains. There was a peg on the wall for a coat, and a small table beside the bed, and nothing else in particular. "Good?" Charlie said. "Good?" Harry said. Charlie nodded and left him to settle. Harry sat on the edge of the bunk for a while, without unpacking through the window. The mountains were going from gold to grey as the sun moved. Somewhere out in the enclosures, something shifted and exhaled, and somewhere further off, something answered it. Sounds without threat in them, just presence, the reserve going on being what it was in the dark. He had never, in his memory, slept somewhere that felt like it had been built for someone to actually live in. The cupboard under the stairs had been a cupboard. The small room upstairs had been storage. Even Hogwarts felt like it had been built for purposes that extended beyond any particular person sleeping in it. This was different. This was a bunk in a building where people came back at the end of a day's work and were expected to rest. He lay back, he looked at the ceiling. He didn't sleep for a long time, but it was not the bad kind of awake. It was the kind where you lie in the dark, listening to something alive, going about its business just beyond the wall, and you understand slowly and without trying to, that you are somewhere. The work was not what Harry had expected, which was to say, it was not spectacular, and it was not dangerous, and most of it involved a clipboard. He was 11 years old, and the dragons were classified XXXX, which meant interaction of the close-up variety was not available to him. This had been explained to him on his second morning, matter-of-factly, by Charlie, who had then handed him a clipboard and a set of feeding observation logs and told him to be on the east platform at 7. Harry had been on the east platform at 7. He had been accurate, and he had been on time, and he had done the work that was asked of him, and this turned out to be in the context of the reserve, what being taken seriously looked like. His days took on a shape: early mornings on the observation platforms, logging activity, and feeding behavior from a distance that the dragons appeared to find acceptable. Mid-mornings helping the senior handlers catalog equipment, mend fencing, clean out storage that had accumulated the specific disorder of places run by practical people too busy for tidiness. In the afternoons, Charlie took him on rounds, walking the outer paths of the enclosures, checking barriers, making notes in the margins of the official forms in a handwriting that Harry strongly suspected no administrator had ever successfully decoded. Harry walked beside him and listened. He was not the boy who lived at the reserve. He was Charlie's mate's younger brother, up from Hogwarts for the summer, a bit small for his age and surprisingly quiet. The handlers knew his first name because Charlie had introduced him. A few knew he was from Hogwarts. None of them, in the first 2 weeks, mentioned the scar. Then a new handler arrived from Edinburgh and sat down at dinner across from Harry and said conversationally, "How'd you get that, then?" nodding at Harry's forehead. Charlie said, without looking up from his food, "Childhood thing. Pass the bread?" The conversation moved on. The new handler passed the bread. Harry ate his dinner and did not think about it until he was lying in his bunk that night. And then he thought about it for a while. The deflection had been so smooth that Harry hadn't even registered it as a deflection while it was happening. He had not been rescued from the question. He had simply been handed anonymity casually, the way you handed someone their coat on the way out. It felt, in a way, he didn't quite have words for, like being given something he hadn't known he'd wanted. Charlie taught in the way of people for whom knowledge is primarily physical, during rounds, during observation, in passing, as needed. He didn't lecture. He pointed. The Norwegian Ridgeback, Charlie told him one morning, watching Norberta pace the far end of her enclosure. She was months old, still moving with the particular uncertainty of a creature who had not yet decided what kind of thing she was unusually aggressive for a Ridgeback, which most dragon species were not, and could eat a variety of prey, including birds and rodents as a hatchling, which had been Hagrid's first clue that she wasn't especially typical. The Romanian longhorn was distinct in form, those long golden horns serving both as weaponry and as the feature that made the breed most recognizable. The Hungarian horntail. Charlie pointed at the eastern wall, beyond which the low concussive sound had by now become so familiar to Harry that he'd stopped consciously hearing it, was the most aggressive dragon on the reserve, and its tail was the primary mechanism. He talked about the creatures the way Harry had never heard anyone talk about anything. Not with love, not with fear. With the kind of total, respectful attention you paid to something that could kill you easily and whose situation deserved consideration anyway. "They're not enemies," Charlie said one afternoon, leaning on the observation rail above the horntail's enclosure. A column of fire rose and dispersed 50 meters to their left, and they watched it without comment. Most people think they need to decide whether a dangerous thing is bad or whether they should feel sorry for it. Dragons don't need you to do either. Harry thought about this for some time. He thought it might apply to other things. He asked about the trace on a Wednesday evening, sitting on the step outside the handless quarters in the last of the day's light. He'd been meaning to ask for a week. "Can I practice spells here?" Without getting a warning from the ministry. Charlie considered this with the particular unhurried quality of someone who thought about things before answering them. "The trace works by detecting magic near an underage wizard," he said. At Privet Drive, any magic detected in your vicinity gets attributed to you, because the Ministry assumes the only person doing magic in a Muggle house is the underage person. Here he gestured at the reserve. Generally, there are 43 adult magical practitioners within these walls at any given time, plus the dragons, plus the enchantments on the barriers. The Ministry can detect magic. It can't single you out. Harry took his wand out of his pocket. The evening was warm and still. He cast Lumos, the small light at the end of his wand held steady in the dusk. He cast Wingardium Leviosa at a stone on the path, and watched it lift and hover and descend cleanly when he brought it down. He was not spectacular. He knew he was not spectacular. He was precise and controlled, and the spells did exactly what they were supposed to do. And Charlie watched without commenting, and Harry understood that this was the comment. The first letter from Hermione arrived on a Tuesday, carried by her family's hired owl, and it ran to 4 pages. She had been researching Norwegian ridgebacks and common Welsh greens, with the focused energy she brought to every subject, and she wanted Harry's first-hand observations, and she had attached a list of 22 specific questions in small, precise handwriting. He wrote back 2 pages about Norberta specifically, her coloring, her feeding behavior, the way she held her wings when she was pacing, and addressed 3 of Hermione's questions and told her the rest were good and he'd get to them. Ron's letter arrived the same week, much shorter, in the large looping scrawl that always looked slightly surprised to find itself on paper. The burrow felt bigger without Harry and the twins there. Percy was polishing his prefect badge again. Fred and George had discovered gnome repellent and put it in Percy's shampoo, which had achieved results Percy was not prepared to discuss. It was raining. Ron was eating Mum's cooking and reading, and it was fine. Ron did not say he was lonely, in the way people are when a place they are used to has the wrong number of people in it. But Harry had lived in a house with the wrong number of people in it for 10 years, and he could read the gap in the letter. Then, at the bottom, almost as an addition, Ginny had been strange since she got her Hogwarts letter. Quiet in a way she usually wasn't. Ron wasn't sure what to make of it. Harry read this paragraph twice. Ginny was 10. She'd turn 11 in August and would be starting at Hogwarts in September. She was the youngest, the only girl, and by all of Ron's previous descriptions, she had the kind of loudness that came from growing up outnumbered and knowing precisely how to be heard. Strange didn't quite fit, he wrote back. Strange how? Ron didn't answer for a week. When the reply came, it was 3 lines. She was fine, probably nervous about Hogwarts. He'd asked, and she told him not to fuss. Harry read this and believed it. The reserve was loud and warm and present, and Norberta was beginning slowly to stop flinching when he walked past her enclosure. The summer had a rhythm, and he was finding his place in it. He folded Ron's letter and filed it away with the others, and did not think about Ginny again for several days. He would remember later that he had believed it without question. He would remember exactly when he had stopped. Harry turned 12 on a Friday in Romania in the sun. This was already categorically different from every previous birthday in his conscious memory, none of which had involved sun or Romania, and most of which had not technically involved anyone acknowledging that a birthday was occurring. The Dursleys had their own traditions around the 31st of July, and the primary one was that it was a day like any other day, and Harry was expected to treat it that way. And he had, because he had not known yet what to compare it to. Charlie had no framework for ignoring a birthday. Harry suspected it was structurally impossible for a Weasley to have such a framework. He had heard enough about Molly Weasley's approach to celebrations to understand that birthdays in that family were not optional. Whatever the reason, Charlie told him at breakfast that they would be doing something about dinner, and then, apparently, told the handlers the same thing, because at dinner there appeared on the table a construction that had started as a cake and arrived as something somewhat adjacent to a cake, and decorated with what seemed to be an attempt at 11 candles that had become 12 somewhere in the execution. But the flavor, once Harry tried a piece, occupied a territory that was entirely its own. Charlie watched him eat the first piece with an expression that was largely suppressed laughter. "It's good," Harry said carefully. "It's not," Charlie said. "Dimitri made it. Dimitri is brilliant with a horntail and cannot bake. These are not related skills." Harry ate a second piece. He wasn't certain why. Something in him wanted to eat the second piece, and he decided not to interrogate it. It was a good morning. In the afternoon, it became quieter. An owl arrived, just after the midday meal. Harry saw it come in from the north, a large, tawny bird with the purposeful trajectory of official post. It landed on Charlie's arm, and Charlie looked at the seal on the letter, and something in his expression shifted slightly. He read the letter standing up, leaning against the outside wall of the handler's quarters, and then he folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, and he did not say what it was. Harry watched this from the observation platform, and made a note in his log that the Longhorns were restless in the afternoon heat, and then he went back to watching the Longhorns. He had been learning over the weeks to wait. That evening, after dinner had been cleared, and most of the handlers had drifted to their various evenings, Charlie sat down across from Harry at the far end of the long table and put both hands flat on the wood and said he had something Harry should know. He explained the blood protection the way he explained most things, directly, without unnecessary preamble, in the practical voice of someone who understood that facts were not less painful for being delivered gently, but who tried to be decent about it anyway. Lily Potter had loved her son. When she had died for him, deliberately, when she had been given the choice and refused it, that love had become something that the laws of magic recognized as a category of sacrifice, and the protection it created had attached itself to the nearest living blood relative. That was Petunia Dursley, née Evans, Lily's sister. As long as Harry called Petunia's home, home, and returned there each year before he came of age, whatever remained of Voldemort could not touch him. The charm was Dumbledore's design. The Dursleys had been Dumbledore's choice. The protection held until Harry turned 17. "That's the 31st of July, 1997, Charlie said. 5 years from today." Harry was quiet for a moment. "My mum did that," he said. Yes, he'd known his parents were dead. He'd known since Hagrid told him, and he'd carried it since then as the particular fact. It was real, inarguable, present in him the way an old injury was present. Not always sharp, but always there. He had not, until this moment, understood the shape of what Lily Potter had done with the last few seconds of her life. He had not understood that it had been a choice, and that the choice had created something with rules and requirements and an expiry date, and that those requirements were why he had grown up, where he had grown up. "He put me there because of the magic," Harry said Dumbledore. "Not because—" He stopped. "Not because he didn't care," Charlie said. "That was the reason." Harry considered the table's surface for a while. He had assumed, in the wordless way of assumptions you've never examined, that his placement with the Dursleys was a kind of afterthought. A child deposited with the nearest available relatives by someone with larger concerns. He had not been angry about it precisely, because you could not be angry at something you had never thought to question. He had just known it was the shape of things. He now understood it to be a decision made by a specific person for a specific reason, before Harry had been old enough to have opinions about it. He was not grateful. He was not quite angry. He was, for the first time, holding an explanation in his hands and feeling the unfamiliar weight of it. "Does it mean I have to go back?" he asked. "Not necessarily for the whole summer," Charlie said. The letter was Dumbledore raising the question, whether you spending the summer here breaks the charm or maintains it. He paused. "I'm going to write back." "With what?" "With a case." Charlie looked at him steadily. "That the charm needs you to go back once a year, not to live there indefinitely. That there's a difference between maintaining a piece of magic and putting a 12-year-old in a place where he's not wanted for 9 months at a time." He let that sit for a moment. "And that, you being miserable, doesn't make the magic stronger." Harry didn't say anything. Charlie picked up both their cups and went to refill them, and the conversation ended there for the night, in the way of Charlie's conversations, which stopped when the important things had been said and didn't require filling in after. Later, lying in the dark with the sounds of the reserve coming through the window, Harry thought about the word home. The blood protection, he understood now why it existed, what held it in place, required that he call Petunia's house home. That was the mechanism. That was what kept it working. He had to mean it, or near enough to meaning it. Each year when he returned, he had lived there for 10 years. He had slept in a cupboard, and then in a small room. He had eaten at their table, and worn Dudley's cast-offs, and referred to the address when anyone asked. He had never, in his conscious memory, said the word home about it, and meant it. He had said. He had just never put anything behind it. He wondered whether the charm was sophisticated enough to tell the difference. Whether Dumbledore's magic could measure the distance between a word spoken and a word meant. He thought it probably could. He thought Dumbledore, from what he understood of him, probably designed things to account for the complicated cases. He lay there for a long time. Outside, something large shifted in the dark. The mountains held their shape against the stars. Harry was 12 years old, and he had just learned why his mother's death had taken the form it had taken. And somewhere in that information, there was grief he didn't quite know how to find yet. And also something that was not quite relief. The word home sat in his mind. He thought, "I have never meant it, and I am here." He did not finish the thought. He let it rest unfinished, in the way that some things need to rest before they can be looked at clearly. And the reserve went on around him, present and indifferent, and entirely itself, and eventually he slept. Charlie wrote the letter the next morning and said nothing about it, but Harry knew what it was. He watched from the east platform while Charlie sat at the table outside the handler's quarters with a fresh sheet of parchment and the particular focused stillness of someone composing something they intended to mean. An owl waited on the fence post with the patience of a creature that had learned to wait for things. Harry logged the Longhorn's morning activity and did not ask questions and let Charlie work. How? He understood what the letter contained because Charlie had said what he believed. Simply the night before, the blood protection required a return, not permanent residence. Voldemort's wraith had fled when Quirrell died in June and had no body, no followers actively gathering around him, no capacity to threaten Harry in any direct way until he regained physical form, which would take years. The Dragon Sanctuary was a restricted, ministry-approved location staffed by trained adult wizards. Harry at Privet Drive had never been a fortress. He had been an 11-year-old in a Muggle suburb whose only defense was a charm tied to his aunt's address. The charm didn't require 9 months a year. It required an annual acknowledgement. These were Charlie's arguments, and they were sound, and Harry believed them. And he waited to find out whether Dumbledore would. Dumbledore's reply arrived 3 days later. Charlie read it, standing up again, in the same spot by the wall as the first time, and Harry watched from across the yard and registered that whatever was in the letter had not closed the question. Charlie came and found him on the afternoon observation shift and sat down on the platform rail and said, "He's not disputing the argument about the blood protection. What is he disputing?" Charlie unfolded the letter and read aloud from it the precise section without preamble. Does Harry wish to be protected, or does he wish to be prepared? He looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him. The mountains were very blue in the afternoon light somewhere over the eastern wall. The horntail made its low, pursive announcement and then subsided. He thought about it for most of the rest of the day. He thought about it through the afternoon rounds and through dinner and through the washing up, turning it over without arriving anywhere definitive. It was the kind of question that looked like a simple binary from the outside and revealed itself, when examined closely, to contain something with much more complicated edges. He found Charlie in the evening, sitting outside with a cup of tea, looking at the mountains. "What's the difference?" Harry said. Charlie considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Protected means the charm works and you're never in danger. Privet drive, blood magic, sealed off from whatever's coming. Dumbledore's design keeps you safe for as long as it can hold. Prepared means something different, means you know what's coming and you build the capacity to face it. Training, knowledge, experience." He turned the cup in his hands. "Those two things aren't always in conflict, but Dumbledore thinks they might be, for you specifically." "Why specifically me?" "Because of who's after you," Charlie said simply. "Protecting you means keeping you contained. Preparing you means letting you out." Harry sat down on the step. "Is there an option where both happen?" Charlie was quiet for a moment. "Dumbledore thinks those two things are in conflict for you," he said. "I'm not sure he's wrong." They sat with that for a while without trying to resolve it, which Harry was also learning was something Charlie was capable of, letting a hard thing be hard without rushing to make it easier. The next morning, Harry took out a fresh piece of parchment and wrote to Dumbledore. He had never written to the headmaster without a specific crisis to report. The letter took him 3 drafts and about an hour. The final version was short. It said he understood Dumbledore had concerns about the arrangement. He wasn't asking for reassurance, and he wasn't asking for permission he hadn't earned. He wanted to know one thing. If he stayed at the reserve in Summers, was he safer or more vulnerable than at Privet Drive? Not in principle, not in theory. In practical terms, given everything Dumbledore knew that Harry didn't. He said, "I know you know more than you're telling me. I'm not asking for everything. I'm asking for this one thing." He showed it to Charlie before he sent it. Charlie read it once, the whole way through, without commenting. He handed it back. "No changes," Harry said. "No changes," Charlie said. Harry thought he detected something in Charlie's expression, not pride, exactly, because it wasn't Charlie's manner to produce pride about other people's work, but something adjacent to it. A recognition of a quality in the letter that he hadn't expected from the Harry who'd arrived 3 weeks ago, the one who'd have found the answer himself, alone, in the dark, without telling anyone what he was looking for. Hedwig carried it north that evening, and Harry waited. The incident at the Horntail enclosure happened the following afternoon. A handler from the northern sector. Harry didn't know him well. He'd only been at the reserve a few days. Approached the east barrier of the Horntail enclosure from the wrong angle. It was not a large error. It was the kind of error that was large enough. The barrier was designed to be approached from the south face at distances greater than 5 meters. approached from the east at close range, there was a gap in the overlapping enchantment. The handler was 4 meters from the east face when the Horntail noticed him. Harry was 20 meters away, on the outer path with his clipboard. His whole body moved toward it before he'd made any decision. A year of being the person who ran toward things, the troll, the stone, any trouble in any corridor, had built something in his muscles that did not wait for instructions. He took 2 steps. He shouted the warning instead. He stepped back and away from the enclosure wall, out of the potential trajectory of anything that might come over it, and he shouted the handler's name and the direction, and watched the senior handlers come from 3 different points in a converging movement, and the handler backed away from the east face, and the Horntail made its displeasure known to the general sky without connecting with anyone. And in 30 seconds, it was over. Charlie arrived at a controlled run. He scanned the area, the barrier, the handler, the path, and his eyes found Harry, standing correctly 8 meters from the wall, with his clipboard at his side. He said nothing. Then, at dinner, the table was louder than usual. The specific loudness of people who have processed adrenaline and need to release it through noise. Harry ate his food and listened and did not contribute to the loudness, because he was sitting with something else. The memory of those 2 steps he'd taken before he stopped, the gap between instinct and decision, the fact that the gap had existed and that he had found it in time. Later, when the table had mostly cleared, Charlie sat down across from him. "You saw it, and you didn't run in," Charlie said. "You told me not to." "Lots of people know they shouldn't," Charlie said. "You didn't." There was a small pause between them. Harry understood what Charlie was weighing, and he understood that in Charlie's scale of things, which had been calibrated against a class of creatures that could kill a trained adult in seconds if approached without full attention, stopping himself in those 2 steps represented something real. Not a small thing, not a lesser thing than courage, a different kind of courage, harder in some ways, the kind that required you to override what you were rather than act from it. It was, in Charlie's world, as significant as anything Harry had done in the dungeon under Hogwarts at the end of the school year. Perhaps more. Down there he had run toward because he hadn't known not to. Up here he had stopped because he did. Charlie stood up, collected his cup, and went inside. Harry sat with it for a while, watching the last of the light leave the mountains, and thought that he was beginning slowly to understand what Dumbledore's question actually meant. Dumbledore arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in late August via Portkey, wearing robes of deep purple that were almost certainly the most inappropriate garment for a Romanian summer. He was very tall and very old and appeared unbothered by both. He straightened, adjusted his half-moon spectacles, and looked around at the meadow and the dark pines and the reserve walls, with an expression of a man who had wanted to see a landscape for some time and was pleased to find it met his expectations. His long silver beard and hair caught the afternoon light, his blue eyes had a quality. Harry took a moment to name present. Dumbledore was paying attention, and being on the receiving end of that attention was different from most of Harry's experiences of being noticed. Charlie met him at the boundary gate, shook his hand. Dumbledore thanked him with warmth that seemed genuine and without theatre. Then he looked at Harry. "Harry," he said, "not Mr. Potter. Just Harry," in the voice of someone who had been thinking about this particular person for some time. "Hello, sir," Harry said. Charlie led Dumbledore along the outer path first. Dumbledore walked with his hands clasped behind his back and asked Charlie questions about the Longhorn's enclosure dimensions with a focus that seemed entirely genuine, and Charlie answered in detail, and Harry walked 2 paces behind them and watched the exchange and noted that Dumbledore listened without performing listening. He was simply interested, in the manner of someone whose interest had no ulterior function. They settled at the table outside the handler's quarters with 3 mugs of tea that Charlie had made imperfectly. Dumbledore wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at Harry across the table and did not hedge. The blood protection, he said, was real and not metaphorical. The mechanism required that Harry acknowledge Petunia's home as his own, return to it, name it his, before his 17th birthday. It required a minimum, a return, a presence, a formal acknowledgement. 1 week per summer is sufficient, Dumbledore said, possibly less, but 1 week is defensible. I can do 1 week, Harry said. He considered how to say the next part. It's not a home and has never been one. I want you to know that I understand what I'm doing. When I go back, I'm maintaining a piece of magic. That's what I'm doing. Not going home. Dumbledore was quiet for a moment. Harry had expected something that looked like regret or apology, the careful kindness adults deployed when they had made decisions that had cost a child something and knew it. What he got instead was more like respect, a recognition of something said plainly and received plainly. Yes, Dumbledore said, that is what you are doing, and I am glad you understand it in those terms. He did not apologize. He did not say the Dursleys had been unkind. Harry found, to his own surprise, that this was easier than an apology would have been. Dumbledore looked at Harry over his spectacles with the same full attention. Tell me what you have learned this summer, he said. Not what happened. What have you learned? Harry thought about it carefully. Behind Dumbledore the reserve went about its afternoon. The distant percussion of the horntail, the smaller sounds of handlers on the outer path. To stop before I move, Harry said. Dumbledore waited. He didn't fill the silence. He simply waited, in the way of someone who understood that the first part of an answer was rarely the whole of it. When something unexpected happens near the enclosures, Harry said, your instinct is to respond, and the first instinct is usually wrong because you haven't figured out yet what's actually happening. Charlie says most injuries happen in the first 3 seconds because people commit to a direction before they know which direction is safe. So the first thing you learn is to stop, find out which way the thing wants to go, then move. Why does that matter? Dumbledore asked. In practical terms, because if you move wrong near a dragon, you're dead, Harry said. So you find out what direction it wants first, Juan. And then you're still probably going to have a bad day, but at least you've made a decision rather than had one made for you. There was a silence. Dumbledore took off his spectacles and looked at the middle distance with an expression that had changed. Not louder, not more emphatic, but quieter, more particular. I spent 30 years, he said. James Potter was a magnificent young man. He was brave and loyal and exceedingly bright. He never once paused to check. He did not elaborate. He did not draw a line between the father and the son. He said it, and the afternoon absorbed it, and he put his spectacles back on. I approve the arrangement, Dumbledore said. You will spend your summers here as a ward in the care of the Weasley family. You will return to your aunt's home for 1 week each summer before the end of July, at which time the blood protection will be renewed. This will continue until your 17th birthday. I understand the terms, Harry said. He understood them in the way Charlie had taught him to understand things that required maintenance. Precisely, without sentiment, with full acknowledgement of what they were. He would go back to Privet Drive 1 week each year because the magic required it. He would do it the way he checked barrier integrity on rounds, carefully, without fuss, because the function mattered even when the task did not. He would not pretend the week was something other than what it was. He would go and stay the minimum and leave without drama, and the charm would be renewed. And whatever Voldemort was, in the meantime, wraith, rumor, the hollow shape of a thing waiting to reconstitute itself, would find that door closed. Dumbledore left within the hour, via the same meadow, the same knotted portkey rope. He shook Charlie's hand. He told Charlie that he thought the reserve suited Harry well, and that he was grateful for what had been given here this summer, and the way he said it made Harry feel that he was not being thanked. It was more like being accurately described. He looked at Harry one final time with what Harry would later think of as calibration, as though something had been measured and noted in a ledger that Dumbledore kept in a place Harry could not access, and the number just recorded. Then he was gone. The meadow was quiet. The mountains were going gold at their peaks. Charlie stood beside Harry for a moment without speaking. "All right?" Charlie said. "Yes," Harry said. He thought about it. Actually, yes. Charlie nodded the nod of a person receiving a piece of information and filing it correctly, and they turned back through the gate. That night, after dinner had been cleared and the other handlers dispersed, Charlie stayed at the table with the last of his tea and asked Harry a question no one had asked him before, not once in 12 years. "What do you want to be when you grow up?" Harry looked at him. Charlie said it without irony and without the weight adults usually gave it. They tended to mean, what will the boy who lived become? Where will you point yourself when the time comes? This was not that question. It was the original version, the one that belonged to 12-year-olds sitting in the early dark in Romania, the version that assumed the person asking was genuinely interested in the answer. Harry thought carefully. "I don't know," he said. He heard what he'd just said and heard it correctly. It was the first time he had answered a question about himself, without reaching for something he was already supposed to be. He had not said, "I want to be an Auror, or a handler, or safe." He had not said, "I want to be the person who survives." He had just said he didn't know. "That's the right answer," Charlie said. "That's the correct one at 12. Most people that age already have an answer they've been told to have. Not knowing is where things start." Harry looked at the dark sky above the reserve. Stars at altitude were excessive, bright and unambiguous and very far away. The horntail had gone quiet for the evening. The smell of smoke was in the air, the way it always was here, carried in everything, the particular scent of a place that didn't burn but was always warm. He thought, "I don't know what I want to be. I don't know what I am, except a collection of things I've survived and been handed, and a set of things I'm learning. And this place," he found sitting with this that it felt less like an absence than he'd expected, more like a room with good light that hadn't been furnished yet, and the furnishing was not anyone else's task. "I think I agree," he said. Charlie collected both their mugs and went inside, and the reserve went on around Harry in the dark, present and enormous and entirely uninterested in his conclusions, which was, he had come to understand, one of the things he liked most about it. The week at Privet Drive was not good, but it was short, and Harry had known in advance what it would be, which made it a different kind of bad than the kind he was used to. He arrived on a Wednesday, via portkey to a drop point in a park 3 streets away, and walked the rest of the distance with his trunk. The house smelled exactly as it always had. Clean carpet, bleach, the faint ghost of Petunia's cooking. His room was exactly as he'd left it. Vernon ignored him with the determined efficiency of a man who had decided to treat the arrangement as an inconvenience rather than an outrage, and was sticking to the decision as a matter of self-preservation. Harry ate Petunia's cooking and read and slept in the small bedroom and avoided drawing attention. On the morning he was leaving, he came downstairs to find his trunk already by the door, which meant Petunia had moved it and therefore knew he was going that day, which meant she had been tracking it. He was pulling on his jacket when she came into the hall. She looked at him for a long moment, not warmth, not the usual bored hostility either, but something that had no name Harry could locate, something more careful than either. He did not ask. He had learned slowly and over many months that asking the Dursleys about their silences produced nothing useful. He filed it the way Charlie had taught him to file things that seemed out of place, noted, stored, wait for more data. He left without incident. The charm was renewed. He did not look back at the house as the taxi pulled away, but he was aware of the window and of whether the curtain moved. It did not. The burrow arrived like the end of a held breath. The kitchen was full of noise, and the smell of something in the oven, and the particular organized chaos of a family of many people, all trying to leave for the same place at the same time. Molly moved through it at speed, checking things off a mental list that was clearly non-negotiable. Arthur was at the kitchen table with a small mechanical device, something with a coiled spring, examining it with more attention than he was giving his toast. Fred and George were arguing on the stairs. Percy came through in his robes already, prefect badge pinned, and the look he gave Fred and George suggested the argument was about him. Harry came through the door, and Ron grabbed his arm and said, finally, with the emphasis of someone who had been alone in his immediate vicinity for some time. "She's been in a mood all morning," Ron said, very quietly, tilting his head in the direction of the stairs. Harry followed his look. Ginny was standing at the bottom of the stairs in her new school robes. She'd turned 11 in August, and they were slightly too big, the way first-year robes always were, the sleeves slightly long. She was watching the kitchen with an expression that was on the surface excited. This was her first time Hogwarts, everything she'd been waiting for. But Harry looked at her with the eyes he'd spent the summer training and read something under the excitement that didn't fit. She was holding the strap of her school bag with both hands, not swinging it, not wearing it. Holding the strap in her fists like something she didn't want to put down. Her knuckles were slightly white. He filed it. Platform 9 3/4 arrived with its usual controlled chaos. The hissing of the Scarlet engine, the thick white steam rolling across the platform, families compressed into the last 5 minutes of goodbye. Molly kissed everyone's foreheads in rapid succession. Arthur shook Harry's hand with the particular warmth he always deployed. Harry had noticed that Arthur's warmth was not performed. It was simply what Arthur was, not a choice but a condition. Fred and George said goodbye to no one in particular and immediately vanished in the direction of their year group friends with a speed that suggested prearrangement. Percy had already found the prefect's carriage before they'd fully boarded, and was visible through a window. Sitting very straight, Harry and Ron found a compartment and settled. The train started. Ron immediately launched into a comprehensive account of the summer, the gnome repellent in Percy's shampoo, which had produced an effect on Percy's hair that Ron described with evident satisfaction. Arthur's broken lawnmower, disassembled at the kitchen table for weeks. Harry listened and laughed in the right places. And then Hermione Granger appeared at their compartment door with her bushy brown hair and her already packed book bag and an expression of focused enquiry. "I've been waiting to ask you properly," she said, sitting down opposite Harry and opening her bag. "I have 17 follow-up questions about the reserve." "Right," Harry said. She had them written down. The first 4 were about Norberta specifically. Comparative growth rates for Norwegian ridgebacks versus the reserve's other juvenile specimens, where the Hagrids described diet for her as a hatchling had caused any developmental anomalies the handlers could identify. Harry answered what he knew, told her he didn't know the rest but could write to Charlie, and watched Hermione write down, "Ask Charlie" in the margin. "What about the horntail's nesting behavior?" she asked. "Ground level or elevated?" "Elevated where possible," Harry said. "The enclosure wall is reinforced on the north and east faces because she prefers the upper register. Charlie says the tail mechanism is the primary weapon, but the nest positioning is defensive. She can see all approach vectors from height." Hermione wrote this down with the focused speed of someone filing information in a system that had very specific places for things. Ron was watching Harry with an expression that was not quite readable, not suspicious, not confused exactly, more like someone trying to locate a change they'd noticed but couldn't name. Harry had said more things about dragon defensive positioning in the last 45 seconds than in the entire previous year of knowing each other. The rest of the journey went quickly. Harry answered 3 more of Hermione's questions, ate cauldron cakes from the trolley, and watched the hills outside shift from summer brown toward autumn. Going back to Hogwarts felt different this year. Not home, but not foreign either, somewhere in between, a third kind of place he didn't have a word for. The ceiling of the Great Hall was dark and full of moving clouds when the first years were brought in. Harry watched from the Gryffindor table. The sorting took some time. There were more first years than he'd remembered from his own year, or maybe he was just more patient now. Ginny came up near the middle of the list. She sat on the stool, and the hat descended over her eyes, and she went very still. She had her hands in her lap, and she did not fidget. She sat in silence until the hat placed her in Gryffindor, and the table erupted, and she stood up and her face did the thing Harry expected, relief, happiness, the end of the particular first-year anxiety of not knowing where you would land. But the relief was too intense. Harry noticed this without deciding what to do with it. He had spent a summer learning to note the difference between what a creature was presenting and what was underneath, and the gap in Ginny's face between the relief and the expression below the relief was not nothing. He applauded with the rest of the table. The sorting finished. Dumbledore rose and welcomed the new students and the old, and the food appeared. And then, before they ate, he introduced the new Defense Against the Dark Arts professor, with the particular grave courtesy Dumbledore brought to all formal occasions. The man who stood up was large and blonde, with hair that waved in a way that hair did not wave without assistance, and very white, very even teeth, and dress robes of a turquoise that caught the candlelight of the Great Hall in a way that suggested the candlelight had been considered as a factor when they were chosen. He smiled at the hall, with the smile of someone who had long since concluded that rooms were improved by his presence in them, and who expected agreement. He spoke for 4 minutes. Harry counted. The speech was mostly about himself. Harry looked at the hands on his lap and thought clearly and precisely. Charlie would hate this man. He thought Charlie would spend 30 seconds in his company, register the absence of anything real behind the performance, and return to whatever he'd been doing with the same expression he wore when a new handler made an unnecessary flourish near the Longhorn's pen. Not contempt. A clinical assessment. The difference between knowing a thing and knowing how to talk about it. Charlie had made that distinction once, sitting on the observation platform with the mountains behind him, and Harry had understood it as a general principle. He was understanding it now as a specific one. He reached for his pumpkin juice and said nothing, and the feast began. Potions had always been the worst class. It was still the worst class, but it was the worst class in a different way now. Snape moved through the dungeon in his usual fashion, black robes, black hair, the particular cold disdain of a man who had made contempt into a teaching style, and Harry sat at his bench and worked precisely and did not react. He had spent a summer in proximity to a Hungarian horntail, which was a creature whose hostility was absolute, impersonal, and backed by the physical capacity to end the problem permanently. Snape despised him. Harry had decided, somewhere around August, that these were not the same thing, and that behaving as though they were had been costing him more than it was worth. He was not fond of Snape. He was not afraid of Snape the way he had been. The distinction, he had come to understand, mattered. Ron watched him from across the bench one afternoon as Snape made a comment about his stirring technique, and Harry corrected the angle without any visible feeling about it, and Ron said afterwards in the corridor, "Huh, that was weird." "You used to go red." "Did I?" Harry said. "You used to go red, and then you'd look like you were trying very hard not to do something." "I'm still trying not to do something," Harry said. "I'm just better at it." The defense against the dark arts lessons were a different problem entirely. Lockhart occupied the Dada classroom the way certain species occupied territory. Loudly, expansively, with a confidence that appeared to rest on the assumption that the territory had been waiting for exactly this occupant. The room was covered in his portraits, framed, painted, each with a slightly different rendering of the same very even smile. He assigned his own books. He ran lessons that circled back to himself with the regularity of something mechanical, something set up to do exactly this and nothing else. Harry sat through them. He had a patience he had not had in year one. Not the patience of someone who didn't care, but the patience of someone who had watched Charlie handle an actual XXXXX class creature and understood, at a cellular level, the difference between a person who knew things. The distinction was not subtle when you had a reference point for the genuine article. He did not say this to Ron, because Ron would have found it satisfying in a way that would have made him say it again at the wrong moment. He said it to Charlie in a letter, briefly at the bottom of a report about Norberta's latest developmental notes that Charlie had sent. Charlie wrote back, "Sounds about right. Watch how he behaves when something actually goes wrong." People like that are consistent under pressure. Harry watched. He filed the data. Halloween arrived with the particular heavy atmosphere of a large castle in late October. The smell of pumpkins and candles and rain against the high windows, the corridors louder in the evenings with first years who had not yet calibrated the boundaries of acceptable noise. The feast was the usual excess of food and heat and noise. Harry ate well and didn't think about anything in particular and felt, for most of the evening, simply present. He was on his way back to Gryffindor Tower with Ron and a corridor crowd of other students when the crowd slowed and bunched. Harry came around the corner and saw Filch first, standing rigid in the middle of the corridor, with his hands at his sides and his face doing something that was not quite grief and not quite horror, but was in the space between them. Then he saw what Filch was looking at. Mrs. Norris was suspended stiff and rigid by her tail from the torch bracket on the wall. She was not dead. Her eyes were open, that lamp-like yellow that was usually so restless and alert, but they were empty, fixed. The light was in them, but nothing behind it was responding. On the wall above her, in large letters that had not been there before, in something dark and slow-drying, "Enemies of the Here, beware." Harry read it. He did not step forward. He did not touch anything. He stood at the edge of the crowd that was forming and read it again more slowly, with the methodical attention Charlie had spent a summer installing in him. He looked at the writing, the height of it, the spacing of the letters, the consistency of the medium. He looked at Mrs. Norris. He looked at who was in the corridor around him and how each person was standing, and who looked frightened, and who looked something else, Most people looked frightened. One or two looked as though they were working to look frightened, which was not the same thing. Filch made a sound. It was the sound of someone trying not to make a sound. Harry looked at the writing one more time and then stepped back into the crowd and did not push through to the front and did not try to touch Mrs. Norris or take a sample or read the wall more closely. And when Dumbledore arrived with McGonagall and Snape and the hall began to be cleared, he went where he was directed and did not attempt to stay. That night in the dormitory, he wrote to Charlie. He described the scene the way he would have logged a feeding observation. What he had seen in sequence without interpretation, layered over the facts before the facts themselves were complete. The wording on the wall, verbatim. The state of Mrs. Norris, Filch's cat, petrified a condition he described in terms of what was observable. Unresponsive, eyes open, rigidly fixed breathing. Filch's reaction, the crowd's reaction. The breakdown of who seemed afraid and what kind of afraid. He had one question at the end after 4 paragraphs of this. It was, what does air mean in a wizarding context? He said he would go to the library, but he wanted to know what Charlie thought it meant first. The reply came within 4 days, written in Charlie's hand. No preamble, characteristic. Don't do anything foolish. Watch. Who's afraid and who isn't? Then, on the next line, a hair in wizarding context usually means someone claiming descent from a founder or some historical figure with a specific legacy to pass on. Salazar Slytherin's legacy, as far as anyone who knows the school's history understands it, is the Chamber of Secrets and the thing he put inside it. That's the edge of what I know. I'm not in the library. Go to Hermione. Harry read this 3 times. He folded it and added it to the small collection of Charlie's letters he kept at the back of his trunk, which he was treating as a kind of secondary research file. He told Hermione the question. She went to the library. The days moved forward into November, and then further, Harry observed. Ginny was pale. She had been pale since the start of term, but Harry had filed it then as first-year anxiety, the ordinary strangeness of a new place. It was November now, and she was still pale, and there was a quality to the paleness that was different from what it had been in September, depleted in a way that September pale was not. She wrote in a diary constantly. He had noticed this across several weeks at the Gryffindor table at breakfast before classes, in the common room in the evenings. It was a small black diary, ordinary-looking, and she wrote in it with a focus that blocked everything else out. He had noticed that when she put it down, she was always fractionally more present afterward, not better, exactly, but surfacing, as though closing the book, let her breathe. He wrote this down at the bottom of his next letter to Charlie, not because he thought it was important, not yet, but because Charlie had said, on the observation platform one August afternoon, that the data that felt irrelevant was the data you'd regret not logging. He noted it as a single line, without analysis, the way he would have noted that the Ridgeback had a new scratch on her left flank that he couldn't trace to a specific incident. Charlie's reply to that letter came back 7 days later. It addressed the Chamber of Secrets question at length and said something about the Horntail's recent feeding behavior that Harry had also mentioned, and it did not address the line about Ginny and the diary at all. Later, Harry would be grateful he had written it down. Later, he would understand that Charlie's silence on that line was not dismissal. Charlie had read it and had noted it himself, and was deciding how concerned to be. The thinking was happening, even if the reply wasn't. For now, Harry filed it and kept watching. The second petrification happened in November, and the third the week after, and by the time the fourth occurred, Harry had enough letters in the sequence to see the pattern without anyone telling him it was there. He tracked it in his letters to Charlie the way he would have tracked anomalous behavior in the enclosures. Dates, names where he knew them, anything he could confirm through his own observation versus anything he was inferring from what other students said. The targets were Muggle-born students. This was not a rumor or a theory. It was a fact he had established by looking at who was in the hospital wing and checking against what he knew of their backgrounds, which was not much, but was enough. He wrote the list for Charlie. He underlined Muggle-born and drew a line under it twice. He did not write down the other thing yet. He needed to think about it first. He had heard the voice in the walls for the first time on the night of Mrs. Norris's petrification, moving fast through the stone above the corridor in a direction he could not point to, saying something he had almost understood. He had heard it again twice since then, both times at a distance, that made the words indistinct, a moving thing, something carried along a route inside the walls. It sounded like what it was. He thought a large creature traveling through a space, built for a purpose, going somewhere with intent. He had not told Ron. He had not told Hermione. He had stood both times in the corridor where he could hear it, not moving, listening until it faded, and then gone where he was going with the feeling of someone sitting on a piece of information that had not yet shown him its full shape. In History of Magic, Professor Binns drifted through the lesson on the Chamber of Secrets with the disengaged delivery of a man who had been dead for some time and had never adjusted to it. Harry wrote everything, every reference, every date, the legend in its original form, the specific note that the chamber was said to house a creature only the true heir could control. After class, Hermione looked at his notes and went very still. Binns said monster once in passing. You got creature that only the true heir could control. I was paying attention, Harry said. She spread her own notes alongside his on the corridor floor and looked at both sets with the expression she reserved for things that fit a larger framework she'd been building. And after 3 minutes, she said she needed to go back to the library. I know, Harry said. He went back to the dormitory. He sat on his bunk with a piece of parchment and a quill, and the particular heaviness of someone about to write the most difficult thing in a series of letters. He had been composing this one for 2 weeks in his head. He wrote it now because the timing had arrived, whether or not he felt ready for it. The letter to Charlie began with the Chamber of Secrets legend and the Muggle-born pattern, which he had established in previous letters. Then it went to the moving sound in the walls. He described it in the same precise terms he would have used for any observation. Distance, direction, as best he could judge, the quality of the sound, the fact that it had moved fast and with purpose, the fact that he had heard it twice, and on both occasions, its direction of travel had correlated with the subsequent discovery of a petrified student somewhere on the corresponding corridor. Then he wrote, I have to tell you something about myself that I didn't know was unusual. Until the end of year 1, I can speak to snakes. I can understand them when they speak to me. It happened at the zoo before I knew I was a wizard, and I didn't know what it was. I found out later. There's a name for it. He paused. I think the thing in the chamber is a snake. I think the moving sound I can hear is it moving through the pipes in the walls. I think I might be able to communicate with it if I could get close enough. I don't know if I want to. I'm telling you because Charlie told me not to make Dumbledore's decisions for him, and I think this is one of those times when the decision isn't mine to make. He sealed the letter and gave it to Hedwig and watched her go. The reply came in 2 days, the fastest Charlie had ever responded to anything Harry had sent him, which told Harry something before he'd read a word of it. It was the longest letter Charlie had ever written. It addressed the Chamber of Secrets legend systematically, the Muggle-born pattern, the basilisk. He had confirmed Hermione's research independently, Charlie wrote, from a brief visit to the Reserve's reference library, and the specific impossibility of what was apparently in the walls. It said, without drama, that what Harry was describing was one of the most dangerous creatures ever classified, and that the decision about what to do about it was indeed not Harry's to make. It ended, tell Dumbledore everything. All of it. The parcel tongue, the voice in the walls, the diary girl, all of it. Don't summarize, don't decide in advance what's relevant. He will need the complete picture, don't make his decisions for him. Then he went to Dumbledore's office. He stood in front of the gargoyle, gave the password McGonagall had provided when he'd asked, and walked up the moving staircase. Dumbledore sat behind his desk in the room full of silver instruments and said, "Come in the way of someone who had been expecting the visit. Harry sat in the chair across the desk and told Dumbledore everything. He told it in order, not because he had rehearsed it, but because that was how he'd been taught to give information, in sequence, without editorializing, before the facts were complete. The moving sound in the walls, first heard on Halloween, its direction and approximate speed, its recurrence. Ginny, her pallor, which had been worsening since September, the small black diary that was her constant companion and that seemed to drain her when she wrote in it and release her fractionally when she put it down. He had been watching Ginny for 3 months, and what he was watching was not improving. And then he said, "I'm a Parselmouth. I can hear the voice in the walls. I heard it twice. I didn't follow it. I'm telling you because I think it's relevant, and because it's not a decision I should make alone." Dumbledore listened with complete stillness. He did not take notes. His questions, when they came, were specific. The wording Harry had heard from the voice, the dates of Ginny's worst days, whether the diary was always the same one, and whether Harry had seen anyone give it to her. Harry answered what he could and said he didn't know where the diary had come from. She'd had it since before term. Dumbledore did not tell Harry what he intended to do, and Harry did not ask. He had learned over the summer that people who actually knew what they were doing worked from full information and made decisions at their own pace. Instead, Dumbledore said, "You have learned something this summer that is worth more than most of what Hogwarts will teach you for the next several years. The ability to bring another person your observations without having first decided what they mean." Harry said, "Have I done enough?" Dumbledore said, "You have done exactly what was asked of you." Harry could not determine on his way back down the moving staircase whether this was reassurance or an honest answer. He went back to Gryffindor Tower and sat by the common room fire and watched the flames and thought, and did not sleep well. The last week of term came. The castle thinned as students left for home. Ginny was not improving. If anything, the final week was worse. She was at the diary before breakfast and after dinner, the small black cover constant in her hands, and she was pale and quiet in a way that reminded Harry of something he could not quite name until he named it. It reminded him of the way a creature looked when it was being bled slowly, not all at once, from somewhere not immediately visible. He wrote to Charlie from the dormitory the night before the Portkey home. "I told Dumbledore. I told him everything. But I don't think telling him fixed it. I can see it. Whatever it is, it's still in her. I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that." He paused, quill over the parchment. "I'll write again from the burrow." He sealed it. He did not know, as he tucked Charlie's letters carefully beneath his folded robes, that Hermione Granger would be in the hospital wing by the end of January. He did not know that when she was found, her hand would be closed around a page she had torn from a library book before whatever found her had found her, torn out carefully with enough time to fold it, and that the page would matter very much. He packed his trunk and went to sleep. They came back from the Burrow on the 1st of January, and Hermione was petrified before the week was out. Harry heard about it the way you heard about things at Hogwarts, through the particular quality of silence that moved ahead of bad news in a school, the way a corridor would go a degree quieter as the information traveled through it. He got there faster than most. The hospital wing was dim and cold, and Madame Pomfrey stood at the foot of the bed, with her arms folded in a way that said she had been standing there for some time, and intended to continue until someone told her something useful. Hermione lay with her eyes open and fixed, her hand closed loosely around something. Her bushy brown hair was spread against the pillow. She was breathing. That was the thing you noticed first, that the breathing was still there, but the rest of her had stopped in a way that went through Harry like cold water. He looked at her hand. She was holding something, a piece of parchment, crumpled at the edges as though she'd folded it quickly. Her fingers were not fully closed. They held it the way a hand holds something when the person carrying it is frozen in mid-motion, and Harry could see a corner of the parchment and the edge of Hermione's small, precise handwriting at the top, and just the first part of a word. Madame Pomfrey said the hand had to be left as it was for the healers from St. Mungo's to assess. D. Quote. Harry stood at the bedside and looked at the partial word and at the 4 letters he could make out from this angle, and he stood there for a long time without saying anything. He could read, Barcy. He stood there for a long time. He wrote to Charlie that night. The letter was short. Shorter than any letter he had sent since the first petrification, because there was less to observe and more to feel, and he was not yet sure how to write the second kind. And also because the thing he needed to say was simple. Hermione had been petrified, and she had been holding something, and he was very nearly certain it was the answer, and he could not look at it yet because her hand was still closed around it. And he was sitting with the particular helplessness of having done everything correctly and having it not be enough. Charlie's reply came in 3 days, and it was the most alarmed letter he had ever sent, which was how Harry knew the alarm was real. Charlie did not perform alarm, and the evidence of it here, between the lines of controlled handwriting, made Harry's chest go tight in a way he had not anticipated. It said, Harry, I don't know how to say this from Romania, except directly. Whatever is in that chamber is a XXXXXX class creature, and you are 12 years old, and you have done everything right. Whatever Dumbledore is doing, let him do it. Keep doing what he asked. Harry read this and put it with the others under his robes in his trunk, and went to breakfast and watched and waited. The weeks had their own particular texture in January, cold corridors, the castle going to a defensive quietness that was different from its usual winter weight. Harry tracked it the way he had tracked everything else this year. What changed? What stayed the same? Where the pressure was building? Ginny was worse. He had thought in November that he understood how bad it was, and January showed him he had been reading a lower point on a scale that went further down than he had known. She was at the diary, before lessons and after, and now, sometimes during. He had seen her twice at the back of classrooms, with it open on her desk instead of the textbook, writing with the fixed intensity of someone who needed to get something out. Ron had noticed. Harry found him one evening standing at the foot of the stairs to the girls' dormitories, just standing there, with his arms at his sides. Ron's face had been stripped of its usual expressiveness, no irony, no readiness to be entertained, just the plain look of someone confronting a thing they didn't know how to hold. His sister was 12 years old, and she was not there. She was elsewhere in the diary or taken by it, and Ron was standing at the bottom of stairs that went up to her dormitory, and could not make himself go up and knock. Harry came and stood beside him. They both looked at the stairs for a moment. Neither of them said it. There was nothing to say that the other one didn't already know. Harry went back to his bunk, and in the morning he went to the hospital wing, and Hermione's hand had been gently opened by the healers the day before, and the page had been removed and placed on the bedside table, and he read it. It said what it said. The heading was, "Of the Basilisk, known also as the King of Serpents," and beneath it was Hermione's compressed handwriting, and at the bottom she had circled the word pipes 3 times and drawn an arrow to the margin where she had written, "Its route through the school." Pipe. The moving sound in the walls, the sound he had been hearing since Halloween, the purposeful fast sound of something large traveling through a space built to carry water, not creatures. Harry sat with this for 2 days. He did not act. He wrote to Dumbledore. A brief letter, 3 lines telling him what the page said, telling him he now understood why he could hear it. Dumbledore's reply came the following evening. In brief, "I am aware of the nature of the creature. I am working on this. Trust the process, Harry. You have given me what I need." He had chosen to trust it the way you chose to trust a procedure. You'd been taught by someone who knew more than you did, and he held to that choice with the conscious effort of someone who was aware it was a choice and not a feeling. He woke up and observed and filed and waited and told himself the information was moving. Dumbledore had all of it. The machinery was working. He did his homework. He attended his classes. He wrote one more letter to Charlie that said, "I am trusting the process, and I think it is the right decision, and it is one of the hardest things I have done." Charlie wrote back, "I know, 2 weeks." The process moved forward at whatever pace. Processes moved, and Dumbledore was doing whatever Dumbledore was doing, and Harry watched Ginny get worse. Ron found him in the common room on a Tuesday evening in late February, and Ron's face had a quality Harry had not seen in it before, something stripped down, the usual noise in Ron's expression removed, and something simpler underneath, something that was just fear and the knowledge that he was not equipped for what he was feeling. "She's gone," Ron said. He had gone to find her for dinner. She wasn't in the dormitory. He had asked the other girls, and none of them had seen her leave. He had found something in the corridor near the second-floor girls' bathroom, a page torn from a diary, and he had read it, and he had come to find Harry. Harry read the page. The writing was Ginny's. He recognized the handwriting, round and careful, and it said that she knew where the entrance was, and she was going in, and she was sorry for everything. Harry stood up. He went to the teacher's corridor and knocked on the first staff room door he reached, and did not stop to think about who was going to be on the other side of it. The person who opened the door was Lockhart. Turquoise robes, blonde hair slightly disarranged, the smile arriving a half-second before the comprehension. Harry did not wait for the smile to process the information it had walked into. He said, "Ginny Weasley has gone into the Chamber of Secrets, and we need to go now." Lockhart said something about his experience with exactly these situations, and already reaching for his cloak before he'd finished saying it, and Harry let him come, because there was no time to manage the alternatives, and the 3 of them went to the second-floor girls' bathroom. Moaning Myrtle was there, lamenting something to the ceiling. Harry looked at the sinks and found the one with the small etched snake on the tap, and he opened his mouth, and what came out was Parseltongue, the language he hadn't chosen and couldn't turn off, the thing that was his, and Slytherins and the creature in the walls. The sink moved. He could not open it. He stood at the edge of the pipe and looked down into the dark, and knew with complete clarity that he was about to do the thing he had promised, across an entire autumn, not to do. He was about to charge in, He was about to be the person who ran toward, rather than stopped. Except that wasn't quite right, and he knew it wasn't right. And he held both things simultaneously as he swung his legs over the edge. Charlie was right, and Ginny was already gone, and the process hadn't been fast enough, and the time for watching was over. He was not reckless, he was not heroic. He was necessary, and that was the only available fact, and he held it as he dropped. Ron followed. The darkness came up around them like water. Somewhere above, he heard Lockhart land. The pipe delivered him onto cold stone in the dark, and Harry was on his feet before the sound of his landing had finished echoing. The chamber was enormous, the kind of enormous that registered not all at once, but in pieces, the ceiling lost in shadow, massive stone pillars on both sides, carved with intertwined serpents that climbed upward into the dark. The floor shallow with standing water that caught the thin greenish light from somewhere unidentifiable. At the far end, a colossal stone face stared out of the darkness, Slytherin's ancient and expressionless waiting. Ginny lay at the base of it. She was on the stone floor, pale as the stone, her red hair spread out behind her. Harry ran the length of the chamber and dropped to one knee beside her and said her name, and she did not move. He could see her breathing, shallow, too shallow, and her hand was cold when he pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, and the cold of it went through him like a warning. She won't wake. Harry looked up. Standing between him and the far wall was a figure he had not seen arrive, a tall, dark-haired boy who appeared to be made of dim light and shadow. Not quite solid, not quite not, with an expression of complete composure that sat wrong on a face that young. The figure looked at Harry with interest. "She's been giving me her life," the figure said, "and she doesn't have much left." Harry did not answer. He looked for the diary and found it on the ground 5 meters from Ginny's outstretched hand. The small black cover, the pages fanned open, and then the sound began. He heard it the way he always heard it, not through his ears first, but through somewhere else, the part of him that Parseltongue occupied. A moving thing, large, old, close. He did not look toward it. He kept his eyes on the stone floor in front of him and tracked it by sound. The displacement of water, the rhythmic motion of something enormously long moving along the ground, the particular resonance of something that size. It was circling. It had not located him yet precisely, but it knew he was here. The figure with Tom Riddle's face said something Harry didn't hear, then fire above him and the sound of enormous wings. Forks came down from the dark like something being lit, crimson and gold, burning with the particular light that was not exactly fire, but was the color of it, and in his talons the sorting hat, ancient, patched, drooping. Harry grabbed it. He had time for one thought, which was not a real thought, but a physical understanding, the kind that arrived from the hands, and then he thrust his hand inside his fingers, found the hilt. The sword came out gleaming, silver and ruby-handled, heavier than he'd expected and perfectly balanced, and it was in his hands, and Fawkes was already moving, wheeling above the enormous serpent, swift and precise. He only understood it from the result. The basilisk reared back, and the terrible eyes were gone, and it was screaming, and Fawkes rose away, and Harry understood that he could look. He looked. He moved on instinct and on something else. The thing that was not instinct, the thing underneath instinct, the 6 months of standing on observation platforms, learning which direction a thing wanted to go before you moved. The basilisk was 12 times his length and older than the school, and it was blinded, and it was in pain, and pain made dangerous things, more dangerous, not less. And he went under the enormous head rather than against it, and drove the sword upward with everything he had. It went in, the basilisk convulsed, the entire length of it moved in a single enormous shudder, and as the sword went further in, one of the great fangs came down and found his arm, and the pain of it was white and total and immediate. He pulled the sword free. The basilisk fell. The venom moved through his arm the way the cold of Ginny's hand had moved through him. Immediate and comprehensive. A fact that could not be argued with. He was looking at the fang still in his arm and thinking, with a clarity that came from somewhere outside normal thought, that he needed to get to the diary before he lost the capacity to get anywhere. He got to the diary. He pulled the fang from his arm. The pain was extraordinary, but brief in the way of things that happen faster than the body can fully process, and drove it through the small black cover. The diary screamed. He had not known a book could scream. The voice was not Ginny's, and not entirely human, and the ink that poured out was black, too black, nothing like ink, and Tom Riddle's memory opened its mouth in the expression of someone who had never considered the possibility that this outcome could exist, and dissolved. The scream stopped. Fawkes landed on Harry's arm. The tears came before Harry had time to ask for them, and the pain went out in a long shuddering wave that left him on the stone floor of the chamber in the dark, with his arm healed and the venom gone and the silence total and enormous around him. "Ginny!" gasped Harry. Moved to her, he crouched beside her and looked at her with the same attention he would have brought to anything important, complete, unhurried, starting from the beginning. She was awake, her eyes were open and tracking, and the color was coming back into her face in slow stages. "Are you hurt anywhere?" he said. She blinked. She focused on him. "My wrist," she said. "And I'm so sorry, Harry." "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean—" "That's not what I asked," Harry said. He took her wrist gently and ran his thumb along the bone, bruised, not broken. Her fingers moved when he pressed them. "Your wrist is bruised. Anything else?" She stared at him. "How did you know to ask that first?" Harry sat back. His arm was whole, the sleeve still dark with blood that had been there and was now not a wound, and somewhere behind him Ron was arriving through the tunnel. "Someone taught me to check before I act," he said. He did not explain further. She seemed to understand that the explanation was not the point. Fawkes carried them out. He had the carrying capacity that phoenix birds apparently possessed as a matter of course, and he went upward with all four of them, Harry, Ginny, Ron, and the blonde professor who sat in Fawkes's grip with an expression of perfect contentment and no awareness of his own name, which he had lost somewhere in the pipe when his own spell had returned to him off the wrong surface, and which he showed no signs of recovering. Harry looked at the professor and thought of something Charlie had said. There was a difference between knowing a dragon and knowing how to talk about one. The man beside him had only ever known the second kind, and when the first had been required, the first had not existed. Harry did not feel sorry for him. He felt something more precise than sorry. An accurate assessment filed away. The aftermath took the rest of the day. Lucius Malfoy arrived at Hogwarts before the story had fully settled. Long, white blonde hair, cold grey eyes, the stillness of a man who had expected to manage this outcome and was discovering it had been managed for him. Dumbledore received him, and Lucius left. On his way out, Harry shoved his torn sock into the ruined diary and passed it to Lucius, and Lucius threw the diary at the house elf bound to his family, and the house elf caught a sock, and a sock from the master's hand was clothing, and clothing was freedom. Dumbledore found Harry later in a small room off the entrance hall, and sat across from him and looked at him with the full present attention of August. Harry said. I went in because the process wasn't fast enough, and she was already gone. Dumbledore said. Yes, Charlie told me not to. And you told him you wouldn't. Harry looked at his hands. His arm was whole. Fawkes's tears had done their work completely. The way Phoenix tears apparently worked. Completely or not at all. Dumbledore said you went anyway because you are who you are, but you did not go because you were reckless. You went because you were necessary. That is a different thing. Harry thought about this. He thought about the pipe and the chamber and the fang and the weight of the sword and Ginny's cold hand and her wrist, bruised, not broken. He thought about the 2 seconds at the Horntails' enclosure in August, the 2 steps he had taken before he stopped. He had not stopped this time, but he had been the person who for 6 months had tried. He thought about the difference. He kept thinking about it for a very long time. The Hogwarts Express ran south through a morning that had not yet decided whether to be sunny, and Hermione had 17 follow-up questions. These were not about the reserve. They were about basilisk venom, and specifically about its relationship to whatever had been in the diary, and whether the venom's Horcrux-destroying properties were limited to basilisk, or whether any sufficiently corrosive substance. Harry said, I've never heard that word. What word, Horcrux? Hermione opened her mouth and then closed it and looked at him with an expression of someone who had just discovered that a sentence she had been about to speak had a very large assumption embedded in it. She wrote something in her notebook. Ron, from his seat beside the window, said, Basilisk, for approximately the 7th time in the last 4 minutes, in the tone of someone who had understood the word for months and still could not entirely reconcile it with the fact of having been in the pipe. It was 60 feet long, Ron said. You've mentioned, Harry said. I keep thinking I've misremembered it as longer than it was. And then I think about it and it was at least 60 feet. Harry looked out the window at the summer fields going past and thought about what 60 feet of something looked like when it was in motion in an enclosed space. And then he thought about something else. The compartment door opened, and Ginny went past in the corridor. She did not stop. She glanced through the glass of the door and found Harry's eye across the compartment, and she nodded. Once brief and level, the nod of someone completing a transaction that required nothing further. And Harry nodded back, and she continued down the corridor. No ceremony in it. The acknowledgement between 2 people who had been in the same dark place and did not need to make it into a story to know what it had been. Ron watched this exchange and turned back to the window with an expression Harry was careful not to look at directly. Later, when Hermione had gone to find Neville and the compartment was quiet, Ron leaned back in his seat and said, without preamble, what was it actually like? In the chamber, Harry thought about how to answer that honestly. Like the Forbidden Forest detention in first year, he said, but with worse odds, and I was more afraid. But you went. Charlie was right that I shouldn't have. And I couldn't. Not. He looked at his hands. The arm was whole, had been whole since Fawkes, but he was aware of the arm in a way that hadn't been there before. Both of those things were true at the same time. I held them at the same time going down the pipe. Ron was quiet for a moment. Then, I think that's the most adult thing you've ever said. Charlie says that's the worst possible thing to become at 12. Ron considered this. Did you become it? Harry thought about what he'd been in September, in October, in January, in the chamber. He thought about the 2 steps toward the Horntail enclosure that he'd stopped himself from taking, and the pipe he hadn't stopped himself from taking. He thought about what was the same and what was different. I think I'm trying not to, he said. The train ran on. The fields went past, and then the suburbs, and then King's Cross with its grey industrial welcome, and Harry went back to the Dursleys for 1 week, because the magic required it. The week was not good. He arrived, slept in the small bedroom, ate Petunia's cooking, stayed out of Vernon's way. On the morning he was leaving, he came downstairs with his trunk and found his taxi waiting in the drive, and Petunia came to the door, which she did not usually do, the usual pattern being that she remained in the house until the departure had been completed, as though watching it confirmed something she preferred not to confirm. She stood in the door and looked at him. "Be careful," she said. He did not know what she meant by it. He stored it as data, the way Charlie had taught him, filed, not decided. He picked up his trunk, got in the taxi, and the door closed behind him. The portkey point was a decommissioned bus shelter on the edge of a park. The rope was already glowing when he touched it, and the world came apart in the usual order, stomach first, then ground. He landed in the meadow. The pines were green, the mountains were the mountains, blue and certain. The air smelled of smoke. Charlie was at the boundary gate. He had the Daily Prophet under his arm. Harry recognized the folded format from 30 meters. He watched Harry cross the meadow, and he did not shout anything or wave. And when Harry arrived at the gate, he looked at him for a moment in the way of someone who had spent a year becoming responsible for another person, and was doing the accounting for it. The particular look of someone holding a weight they had accepted correctly and were not complaining about. He did not say, "I told you not to go in." He said, "You came back. You said, 'Don't go in alone,'" Harry said. Ron was there. Charlie's face did something. He held it for a moment, and then he laughed, actually laughed the specific laugh of someone who had been holding something back since February and had just been given permission to release it, and something in the air between them moved and settled, the way a thing settles when it finds its correct arrangement after being adjacent to it for some time. Neither of them said the word for what it was. The word was family. It was not a metaphor. Charlie opened the gate, and Harry walked through it with his trunk, and the reserve was there, the stone walls, the shimmer of the barrier enchantments in the afternoon sun, the smell of smoke constant and present and not threatening, the low bass percussion of the horntail announcing something to the eastern sky. The handlers' quarters were ahead, the same low, dark building they had always been. The path to them was the same path. Harry walked it. Norberta's enclosure was on the left, set back from the path. He heard her before he saw her, the specific sound of a dragon who had grown into her own movements. Less uncertain than the hatchling he remembered, more deliberate. She was larger. A year made that kind of difference. She was no longer the pale, scrambling hatchling, but a genuine dragon, scaled and solid, smoke drifting from her nostrils, with the ease of a creature for whom fire was a baseline condition. As Harry passed, she raised her head. She looked at him, the amber eyes tracking his movement along the path, her head tilted in the way that Harry had learned over a summer of observation meant she was attending to something. He did not stop walking. He did not make any gesture. He kept his pace and looked at her and kept going. She did not breathe fire. The handlers would argue about this for years, whether she recognized him, whether it was memory or coincidence or neither. Harry never contributed to the argument. He filed it the way Charlie had taught him to file things that were real, but couldn't yet be explained. He put his trunk down inside the handler's quarters and sat on his bunk and looked at the window above it, the mountains in the frame, the same mountains. He was 12 years old. He would turn 13 in 3 weeks on a Friday in Romania. He had a scar and a wand, holly and phoenix feather 11 inches supple, and an invisibility cloak folded at the bottom of his trunk. He had a prophecy that had not changed, that he had been told existed, but not told what it said, that described a future he would have to move toward. Eventually he was not safe, and he knew it. There were things in the world that wanted him dead, and they were not finished, and he was not finished, and that was the correct way to hold both facts. But he was here. He was here, in this building, in this bunk with these mountains, and this would be here tomorrow morning, and the morning after, and the summer after that. It would not shift. It would not become something else while he was sleeping. Inside his head, without trying, he called it home. He was surprised by the word. He sat with it for a moment to make sure he'd heard himself correctly, and he had. The word was, simply there had arrived without ceremony, the way the correct word sometimes arrived, already true before you said it. He thought, I will have to tell Charlie. He did not get up immediately. He sat with the mountains in the window, and the smoke in the air, and the sound of the reserve going about its evening, and he thought about the word. And he thought about what it meant that it had arrived without him reaching for it, and he thought about all the things that were true now that had not been true a year ago. Then he got up and went to find Charlie, and the reserve went on around him, present and enormous and